I would also like to welcome you to Missoula. Our first speaker today will be our Attorney General from Montana. One of the benefits of going to law school in Montana is that we have only one, and all of us that attended law school get to know each other and feel we're part of one large family. Well, Joe and I went to the same law school at different times, and he graduated in 1975. Joe was raised in Helena. He attended the University of Montana. After he graduated from law school, he was an Army officer for a few years and began to practice law in Helena. While he was practicing law, he was elected to the Montana Senate, and he served 12 years in the Montana Senate. In 1992, Joe was elected the Attorney General for the state of Montana. Although he does not consider that his major accomplishment in his life, you should be sure and ask him about his career as a kids sports coach. He seems to think that's a major accomplishment. Joe is married and has 3 children. Attorney General Joe Mazurek.
Thank you, Judge Harkin. I'm not sure it's a major accomplishment, but it's certainly my major interest is coaching kids sports. It's something I've done for a long time. I have three teenage boys. I have a senior in high school, a freshman in high school, and a 12-year-old. And the county attorney in Lewis and Clark County, Mike McGrath, and I had the privilege of coaching the U15 boys state championship soccer team this year. So we are proud of that, but I do consider the Attorney General's job perhaps a little more important, but oftentimes not quite as rewarding, although there are great rewards as well. I too would like to welcome you to Missoula and thank you, and thank in particular Representative and soon-to-be Senator Vivian Brooke, who I learned this morning, you'll all have to ask her. She just returned from the World Population Conference that you've been reading about, so she's probably suffering from jet lag as a result of having just returned from Cairo, Egypt. So I'm sure she'll have some stories to share with you during the course of the conference. But I do thank all of you, and particularly Vivian, for inviting me to open this conference on family violence. I'm really happy to join you for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because family violence is an issue that warrants, and in fact demands, our full attention. One thing I'm learning in my newfound role is that, and I think everyone's learning, is that people all across Montana and across the nation are genuinely concerned about crime, especially violent crime committed by young people. And I'm sure you are all well aware, before we can even begin to talk about reducing violent crime committed by young people, we have to look the issue of family violence squarely in the face. Families teach their kids much more than just the alphabet or how to play soccer or how to ride a bike. In our homes, children learn the general boundaries of acceptable behavior. For some, that means learning to use words instead of fists to resolve disputes, but for others it means learning whoever's the strongest and the meanest rules, a message that is often reinforced by violence so common on the television screen and on our athletic fields. In the last few decades, more and more young people seem to be getting the wrong message at home. We see the consequences of that on the streets of our communities and our nation, and we see it in our schools. In the last 25 years, from 1965 to 1990, the number of violent crimes committed for every 100,000 juveniles has doubled from 150 to 300. And what is really sad is that most of the time, someone somewhere in the community that surrounds these children, a teacher, a probation officer, a neighbor, a child welfare worker, knew long before it happened, when the children were very young, that which kids were going to be in trouble long before they ever got there. They're the ones who have 3 strikes against them before they even get started. I'm sure most of you probably read in recent weeks about the 11-year-old gang member in Chicago who was wanted in relationship to a series of shootings that had occurred. He had been found executed, apparently by members of his own gang, 11 years old. 8 years before that, he had been removed from his mother's care after child welfare workers found cord-like scars and cigarette burns about his then 3-year-old body. After being placed with a grandparent, he continued to bump into the juvenile justice system, first as an unsupervised child and then as a delinquent. Unfortunately, we all have seen similar experiences here in Montana. And unfortunately, our Montana Department of Family Services has had to deal with too many kids who've had circumstances just like him. In fact, in 1993, the Department of Family Services confirmed over 6,000 incidents of child abuse here in the state of Montana. As a parent and as a coach, another statistic I find most disturbing is this. Our teenage children are 2.5 times more likely to be victims of violent crime than any other segment of our population. We can teach our kids conflict resolution skills, we can guide them in the friends they choose, and we can protect them as best we can. But when a kid who's been brought up on a steady diet of abuse and family violence picks up a gun, we can only hope that our kids are not in the line of fire. We have to hope and dedicate ourselves to making sure that every child has a genuine chance to lead a healthy, happy life. That's a tall order, certainly, as all of you know, but it's not impossible. Psychologist Ronald Slavey of the Education Development Center in Newton, Massachusetts, was recently quoted in an article in U.S. News and World Report. He said that while some research has shown that violence is predictable as an IQ, that doesn't mean it's inevitable. Much violence is learned, he argued, and therefore it can be unlearned. So how do we, all of us, make sure that families unlearn violence? We start with what we know works from years of studies and years of experience. We know we have to start early. We know that if we reach kids before they're in trouble, or even better, if we reach parents before the kids are even born, we significantly reduce the problems both for kids and for the community. Healthy Start, an innovative program in Hawaii, has proven this, as have successful programs in the state of New York, where women who were counseled during pregnancy and 2 years beyond were found to be 5 times less likely to abuse their children than those who were not. We know it works. Let's do it here. We know families are where it all starts. Let's make sure that families, mothers and fathers have the support and the skills they need to raise healthy and responsible children. We know we have to involve the schools. Fortunately, in Montana schools, at least the ones I've been involved with recently, are well aware of the problems posed by violence, and they're already working to ensure that our kids are safe in school and that they have the skills they need to resolve conflicts without resorting to violence. We know that this will all take time, perhaps years, to turn this situation around, but that's all the more reason we have to step up our efforts now. We know that we're going to have to spend the state's resources carefully and wisely, but it will take resources. We know that all of us collectively have to be in this together. Solving the problem will take more than money, and it will take more than any one group or profession. It will take everyone in our communities across Montana working together, police and sheriff's officers, teachers, judges, doctors, ministers, social workers, child advocates, parents, and kids, all of us working together in our communities. And we know we can't give up hope. We must hold fast to our belief that indeed we can stem the rising tide of violence in our society. And I believe that we all hope and believe that we can make a difference. To sustain that hope, I think it is important that we not lose sight of the fact that we can and we are doing many good things in Montana already to reduce family violence. Sometimes in these discussions, I think we tend to forget that our children have something very important to say as well. For that reason, over the next 4 weeks, I'll be spending time in a number of different Montana communities visiting as many kids in school settings that we can to talk about violence and how it's affecting them. Beginning tomorrow in Butte and running through mid-October, Superintendent of Public Instruction Nancy Keenan and I are visiting schools and holding community meetings across the state to encourage more discussion and look for solutions to the problems of violence, particularly juvenile violence, in our schools and in our communities. As I mentioned, we'll be going to Butte tomorrow. Next week, next Wednesday, we will be back here in Missoula. We're going to Billings, and then to Glendive and to Great Falls. We hope to have a very successful series of community meetings. We're looking forward to really bringing focus to this issue for a number of reasons. First, I think it's very important we hear from kids in their own words just how they perceive what's going on in their communities, how they perceive the problem, and what role they see themselves playing in the solution to the problems of juvenile violence and family violence. I think one of our greatest challenges is getting them to open up and talk to us, but with the cooperation of school officials, we hope to provide settings that will allow that to take place. I'm also looking forward to learning what each community is already doing to solve the problems. We plan to compile the information that we gather from schools and communities and put that into a report which we can share with other communities in the state as well. The one thing I think we're trying to emphasize in these visits is we recognize going out into the communities that there really is already a lot going on. And perhaps the greatest potential that we have is to learn from one another, and that's a process we hope that we can expedite as well. Hopefully it will fit into and complement the many ongoing efforts that are already underway in the state of Montana and in the communities or at the community level. I would hope, I know you come from across the state of Montana, and I would hope that if you can make it to one of our community forums, you do that. I would encourage you to participate. We're eager to hear from you, but if you cannot, or if we're not coming to your community or near your community, we would appreciate your thoughts in this area as well on what's going on in your communities and what recommendations or suggestions you may have for us. We would like as broad a perspective as possible, or as many people as possible, to be part of the conversation. Even if you don't live in one of the communities that Nancy and I will be visiting, we do hope that you will share your ideas and views with us. Like all of you, I recognize that the issue of family violence is currently enjoying, if you will, its moment in the sun. We have a U.S. Attorney General, Janet Reno, who speaks loud and clear about the need for prevention and early intervention with statements like, "It is my wish that all children in America will have a healthy, safe, and positive future." She has helped focus attention on our nation's children, and I think she will continue to do so in the future. And the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson has probably focused more attention on the issue of family violence than all of the public service announcements that have been ever produced. But if I have learned one thing in my brief public life, it is that the public's attention span on any particular issue can be very short-lived. It is currently and increasingly focused on juvenile and family violence, and I think all of us recognize we must seize the moment that this issue has the nation's attention and act on it and move swiftly if we are to solve these very serious problems. In conclusion, I would like to offer two things as final thoughts as you begin your conference. First, let's make the most of this recent attention to gain ground now and do some genuine good before some other crisis steals the limelight. And second, and probably more importantly, I want to thank all of you for caring about this issue and working so hard in this area, whether it's in the limelight or not. I know that so many of you here today have worked on one aspect or another of the issue of family violence for years and years. on a volunteer basis, on a professional basis, but you've worked for many years. I thank you very much for your sincere and your continuing dedication to Montana's families and for your energy and efforts to solve this very difficult problem that we face. I know that you have very much to discuss in the next few days, and I wish you the very best for a productive and fruitful conference. I also hope to see many of you, those of you from Missoula in this area, at our community meeting next week at Sentinel High School, and I hope to hear from the rest of you during the course of our visits around the state. We want to know, as I said before, the many good things that you have underway already and what collectively we can do to continue to solve these problems. Again, I thank you very much for inviting me to participate. I wish you the very best for a successful conference and look forward to seeing you in your communities. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Judy Wang, and I have the privilege of introducing our next presenter. Our next presenter is Jackie Garcia. She's self-employed as an interpersonal consultant in Billings. She has 3 sons and a very cute little girl. Her major area of expertise is violence, and she has extra specialty in the interests of racial violence and domestic violence. She is very well spoken in the field of domestic violence. She has wide experience speaking on the topic. She is a part-time educator at the Dull Knife Memorial College in Lame Deer, teaching in the Violence Studies course. She's a facilitator for the YWCA Gateway House and the Northern Cheyenne Recovery Center's Batterers and Battered Women's groups. She is a domestic violence instructor at the Montana Law Enforcement Academy. She works as a community consultant with the Billings Area Indian Health Services, working on family violence issues with the Blackfeet, Crow, and Northern Cheyenne reservations. She has testified as an expert in the field of domestic violence in criminal cases. She has lectured as an educator for the Montana State Judges Training Conference on domestic violence. She's also a member of a number of organizations who are working to combat domestic violence. She's a member of the Montana Supreme Court Task Force to study gender bias in the judicial system. She's a member of the management team on the Montana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. She's a board member of the Montana Women's Alliance. She's also a board member of the Young Families Program. She is presently a steering committee member of the first annual Federal Health and Human Services Domestic Violence Conference. She is a National Advisory Council member of the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women. Her topic is the dynamics of domestic violence. Please join me in welcoming Jackie Garcia.
I really am here. I didn't even get to hear what they said about me either. I guess you already know who I am, and I'm here to talk about the dynamics of violence. And to introduce that, one thing I want to say is that I'm real used to doing interactive stuff, so even though we have 100 or more of us here, if you have questions, please stop me and we'll do as much discussion as we can. I teach part of the basic training at Law Enforcement Academy, and I do dynamics of violence there as well. You can't hear me, Lucille? All right. And one thing that they always say to the officers, I'm sure they say it every day to them before I get there, is she's not there to teach you how to be a police officer. She's there to do the touchy-feely stuff with you. She's there to teach you about violence in general. And that's what I feel like I'm here to do. We hopefully are doing this kind of a conference because we want to have a comprehensive view of what violence is. There are several of us from different disciplines who have good education, who have good skills, who have good expertise in what our field is. I'm not here to tell you how to be a good police officer. I'm not here to tell you how to be a good child protective services worker, a good counselor. I might be here a little bit to tell you how to be a good domestic violence advocate, but not too much, because I figure that we're all experts or we wouldn't all be here. My job is to give you a little information about the dynamics of violence, because in being a good police officer, being a good social worker, being a good counselor, being a good domestic violence advocate, if you do not have a pretty clear understanding of that, you will go crazy. trying to advocate for people, trying to just plain do your job. If you have a battered woman that comes in several times and her children, and she keeps coming in and she keeps coming in and she keeps coming in, and you know it's a problem, she says, oh, I know, and you're trying to advocate for her children as a child protective services worker, you're going to feel crazy if you really don't understand what the reasons are for this woman coming in and not getting out, which is what our concept is for the right thing for a battered woman to do. So in an hour, we can't discuss all of the dynamics of what happens in a violent situation. We can just touch on it a little bit. Sandy Hildebrand put several excellent handouts in your manual behind my resume, which I assume they told you about before I got here. So we're going to touch on some of those a little bit. But one thing that I want us to understand and to talk about and to discuss among each other is, what are the dynamics of family violence? I mean, we go here and we kind of expect to be given, well, if this and this and this happens, then I understand the dynamics of family violence. We're not going to really understand it totally unless we start doing some networking. That's why this conference is called a Cohesive Community Approach. One of us, or one field of expertise, is not going to solve the problem. Domestic violence is not a therapeutic problem. Domestic violence is not solely a law enforcement problem. Domestic violence is a political problem. It is a societal problem. And I think that people get a little bit scared when we start saying something's a political problem. But think of the work that you do. You are all, if you are good at what you do, activists within your field. You are all political within your fields, or you just aren't real good at what you do. We can't do that. We cannot be experts at what we do without being political and without being activist. So I want you to just kind of be a little bit open-minded about how we start looking about domestic violence. There's an organization out of San Francisco, California that is called the Family Violence Prevention Fund. They just kicked off a campaign this summer that's called There's No Excuse for Domestic Violence. And what I'm going to show you right now is one of the public service announcements put out by Family Violence Prevention Fund. It's 1 minute, so just watch that and pay attention to how you're feeling about that, and we'll take off from there. Whoops. Can somebody turn that one on, please? I think we're all hooked up together.
Please, don't get like that, please. It's so sad. Don't get like what? No, come here. Don't get like what? Just to get so angry. That's enough of you. Enough. Ow! No! I'm going to give you something to scream about. Get over it. Get out. I'm talking to you. Get out.
Would you turn that off, please?
For information about how you can help stop domestic violence, call us.
Okay, did everybody get a chance to see that? Did you guys see what was happening over there? Okay. One, I just want to make sure that people in the back room all got to see what happened. Somebody just give a brief summary of what happened on here. What did we see? Just physically what happened, because I'm afraid some of the people in the back didn't get to see what the physical acts were that were happening in the video.
A couple is overhearing what's happening in the other room.
Thanks, Vivian. And what do they do? Nothing. Okay. That is a major part of understanding the dynamics of family violence. That is a major part of understanding the dynamics of family violence. I think that we operate under the misconception often, I've heard this said a lot, and I used to believe it myself when I first started doing domestic violence advocacy work, that battered women don't go for help because they're ashamed, embarrassed, their esteem is low. What I have found in my experience and what research has proven since I first started doing this kind of work is that battered women ask for help all the time. They call police officers, they go to social services agencies, they are involved in social services systems, and what happens is that people turn the light off, or that people end up doing a bit of victim blaming. Now, I'm going to talk about 4 reasons why domestic violence continues and has continued to occur in our society. It's just brief, and I'm going to, again, it's really important to understand that these are part of the dynamics of family violence, not just what are his characteristics, what are her characteristics. Yearly, 3 to 4 million family members are beaten in their homes. 20 to 50% of all murders in the United States are committed by family members, and 13% of all murders are committed by spouses. Men can be victims. When I do Law Enforcement Academy, everybody, whenever I do any presentation, people go, well, what about the men? And I get that question all the time. So finally I sat down and figured it out. The statistics say that 90 to 95% of victims of domestic abuse, and these are not domestic violence activist statistics, these are FBI statistics. 90 to 95% of the victims of domestic abuse are women. So that leaves, we can assume up to 5 to 10% of victims may be male. So I started doing at Law Enforcement Academy, I figured, okay, they give me this many hours, they give me 3 hours, so that means if there are 5% of the victims that may be male, I'm going to give 9 minutes of my presentation over to discussing that part of the problem, because I think it's really important that we understand that impact and not just make the assumption that here we have a domestic violence worker, here we have maybe an activist feminist, who knows, we're not going to really make that assumption yet, but this person coming in and telling us that all of the victims are female. Well, we have some pretty good statistics, we have facts that back that up, and so while I don't want any of us to forget the males that may be victims, and I've certainly worked with males that have been domestic abuse victims, but over 13 years I worked with 2 males that were victims compared to hundreds and thousands of females. So I'm just going to say that, and I will, during this talk, refer to victims as female and to perpetrators as male, and I hope that you can all get over that, or celebrate it, one of the 2. Okay. There are 4 major aspects that contribute to the acceptance and continuance of domestic violence today. One is a historical aspect. In our history, in this Western society, man's been the patriarch in religious and other matters, and we still have a patriarchal society. What happens when there is a patriarchal society does not mean that it has to be an abusive society, but what it does mean is we move from a dynamic like this, where we can interact like this as people, to where part of our population has a little more power here. When you have an imbalance of power, often harsh attitudes are more likely to result. So the fact that we have a patriarchy just opens the door, or that we have a historical patriarchy opens the door for violence to be more likely to occur. Anytime you have this kind of imbalance of power, it doesn't mean that the person or persons or institutions with the power have to be abusive, but it means that they're in a lot better position to be abusive. So that's the first part. Imbalance of power, the patriarchal society historically. In the Middle Ages, I mean, we're going back way far in history, but I'll go through this quickly. Middle Ages, men were exhorted from the pulpit to beat their wives, and wives were exhorted to kiss the rod that beat them. So we have a little history there that some of us, thousands of years later, are still trying to overcome some of the attitudes for, okay? Napoleon Bonaparte, who was probably the most influential lawmaker initially in Western society, considered wives and children the property of first their fathers and then their husbands. Now, you got to understand that that makes a real attitude about, about how women are treated. Women were treated, and it wasn't just this little hidden attitude. It was stated in law. Women are women and children are property. It was not until the 1870s in America that courts started to seem to recognize women's human rights. In North Carolina, in the 1870s, there was a law repealed that's commonly referred to as the rule of thumb law. I think most of you have heard that. And the law said that it used to be on the books that said that a man could beat his wife or could chastise her as long as he did it with a stick that was not any bigger than his thumb, wider than his thumb. However, when this law was repealed, the judge's statement was, okay, we're getting rid of this law, but it's not the business of the courts to be invited into the homes. So unless things are very harsh or punishment is very harsh, the windows should be drawn, the doors should be closed, and matters should be taken care of privately within the home. So again, although the law changed, there was still this kind of attitude that you saw this man have on the video, on the commercial, which is, I'm sure that people, I mean, my sense is not that people just go, oh, you know, well, although that does happen, oh, they're stupid, and let's just not pay attention to them. I think that there's some real agony in that decision. Let's let it be, and something will happen, it will be all right, but it's not our business. Okay, the second aspect is societal. Violence in our society is exploited and glamorized. I know that some of you have heard part of this little talk before, but I used to watch Bonanza when I was young. I'm looking at how old everybody is, so you can see, although they are on cable TV again now. And you remember Adam Cartwright? I had a crush on Adam Cartwright when I was little, unlike many of the people that had a crush on Little Joe. And Adam Cartwright was the oldest Cartwright boy. And I remember watching Bonanza, and there was one particular episode where there was this very fiery young woman. She belonged to this Mexican family, and her dad had to leave town for some reason, I don't know, and the young woman was left in the care of the Cartwrights. And we understood in the show that the young woman was about the same age as Adam Cartwright, and I think we thought in the show Adam Cartwright was about 18 or 19. So there's this woman, Hispanic and very fiery, and also kind of snotty. She was not nice. She yelled and screamed, and she was a spoiled brat. And I had this and she wore these great Mexican clothes, and I think that, you know, my Garcia blood was just real attached to her on the one hand, and really put off by her because she was obviously not a nice woman. But during the show, she had said something really mean, not nice, and Adam Cartwright, they were in the room together. Remember, they're the same age as each other. And Adam Cartwright grabbed her and said, if you're going to act like a child, I'll treat you like a child. And he turned her over his knee and spanked her. She, of course, had a fit and is kicking and screaming and yelling. And he spanked her and let her go. And she stands up and starts yelling. And he grabbed her. He kissed her. And she's pounding on his chest and pounding on his chest. And then what happened? You all know. What happened? She melted into the kiss and swooned over Adam Cartwright, just as I would have at the tender age of 10 years or whatever I was. This is the kind of, I'm not that old. I just turned 37 a couple days ago. I'm not that old. This is the kind of thing that we grew up with. Look at the more recent stuff. Anybody remember General Hospital from years ago? Luke and Laura. If you're going to say Luke and Laura. One of the great daytime TV romances, Luke and Laura. Do you know how they got together? He raped her. Luke raped Laura. And then they, you know, dealt with that. We don't see how they dealt with it, but they kind of brushed it aside and they fell in love with each other. And now, 10 years after the fact, Luke and Laura are back on daytime TV, still together, coming from the fact that he raped her initially. we and our children and we as a society see violence that way. We also have a misconception that violence and passion are pretty much the same or walk the same line. I think we need to rethink what violence is in our society. Passion is a whole different thing than violence, and I think that that's why people say stuff like, "Oh, I knew that he really cared about me because he was so jealous. You know, he wouldn't really be that upset if he didn't love me as much." Okay. More societal stuff. There's a lot of pressure in our society still. Now, some of these things, obviously, I hope you understand that I'm not saying that this is how it is and this is how it's always been and poor us. What I'm saying is these are attitudes that have been long-standing, and even though we are making some wonderful progress and things are changing, we still have to deal with these things. There's still a lot of pressure to see home, wife, child as private property, and that they're possessions that need to be controlled. I talk to all age levels of audiences, and when I talk to high schools and colleges, and the guys start teaching each other, and they go, "Yeah, your girlfriend's like that with you. You're pussy whipped." That's the term. If your wife, if your child, if your relationship partner does not comply to being the good partner or the good child, we have a lot of societal pressure put on men to control that in some ways. So even if we don't buy the fact as a society that he should beat the heck out of her when she does that, these guys who are 17, 16 years old are getting razzed by their buddies down the road because they're pussy whipped, or your girlfriend controls you when she expresses an opinion. Okay. Again, that's part of the glamorization and exploitation of violence. You got to be violent to be able to control things. We still have an attitude that the marriage should be saved. I think one of the things that we need to look at is the language that we use. Right now, there's a lot of stuff going on in the country about family preservation, which is wonderful, wonderful. That's a good concept. And there always has to be at least somebody saying, "That's a really good idea, and what about when it's not working? What about when there's violence? What about when it just doesn't work to preserve the family?" Okay? Our homes traditionally and idealistically have been the last bastion of safety, love, and comfort in our society. So it's real hard for us individually and societally to admit that the family unit could be in trouble. It's safer and easier for society to continue the myth of the nonviolent family. If I go home, theoretically, I should be able to go home, and no matter how I do here, if I do a crappy job here, I showed up late with my hair flying, and I didn't hear my introduction, and I did a terrible job, and I should theoretically be able to go home and tell my family, "Geez, you know, I was late. I did this job that I don't know about," or, and I just felt yucky today. Theoretically, they should be able to say, "Well, Jackie, you know, we know you and we know that you usually do a good job," and or they should be able to say, "Well, Jackie, we know you and we know that you're always late and we still love you," and, you know, one of those things should happen, but I should be ensconced in this loving attitude that no matter what happens out in the world, it's okay for me, it's good for me, and my family is good for me and my family is supportive for me. So if I have that kind of family, I'm real happy and glad to share it with my friends, to share it with you all as an audience. But if on the other hand, what happens when I go home is I say, "I was late and this happened and I didn't do as good a job," my family goes, "Well, what do you know, that's how it always was. What do you expect? Why should it be any different?" I'm not going to be real willing to share that information with you. We have pretty much an attitude in our society still that we should have the perfect family. And if we don't, by golly, we sure better not say anything about it, okay? I know that we are in a room full of people who work with a different concept than that. We understand that that's not the way it is, but look at from a societal context, that's still pretty much what you see happening with people. The third aspect is the legal aspect. Historically, it's been very unsafe for police officers, and frankly, it still is. At Law Enforcement Academy, they are still saying during training that an officer called to a domestic violence call is far more likely to be hurt or to be killed than on any other kind of call that a police officer goes out on. Until the 1980s, and in Montana until 1984, there were not many clearly enforceable laws that even discussed domestic violence as an issue. And there have always been assault laws on the books, but there has not been generally an attitude that something that happens within a home between partners is assault. So there were victims being assaulted criminally in their homes, and it wasn't being dealt with. They were getting social work, and that's what the police officers had to do. They had no laws to back them up, basically. There was nothing to cover their butts. So if they went and arrested this guy, you know, the prosecutor didn't throw it out. Okay. Due to the nature and the intimacy in a relationship, often a victim would not witness, would not act as witness, would not sign a complaint. So police officers, even when there were laws, and even now when there are laws, aren't getting backed up. They go in as the knight in shining armor, ready to rescue and do the good thing, and they have often a victim who is saying, you know, what are you doing here in my home? You're violating me. Don't arrest him. Don't arrest him. That's part of the dynamics of violence as well. We need to understand why would a victim do that? She's just been beat up. Here I am as a police officer to save the day, and she's yelling at me and jumping on me. Okay. One thing that I'm just going to add quickly here is that when the law changed in Montana, which was about 1984, I was fossil hunting over by the Crow Reservation, and I was going through Pryor, and I saw this man beating up this woman, and it was real obvious, and she was acting scared. He had her by the hair. She was being pulled back. She was doing what she was trying to protect herself, but she was not coming at him. She was scared. I stopped, and I was going to go and call the police, and luckily the reservation police got there before I got to the phone, so something was happening quickly. But this woman went from being this person that looked totally frightened and like she could not for the life of her say anything, to as soon as the police officers got there and got up close where her partner, or whoever this man was that was assaulting her, they had him under control. She was on the backs of the police, and she wasn't mad at them, but she was yelling at him and saying, hey, you get him out of here, you get him out of here. If this were Billings, he'd be arrested right now. You know, she had heard about the law, but she always also was this person that was just, you know, coming at the police officers. The police officers did a wonderful job, by the way. They did not turn on her. They dealt with him. But she was real, it was like immediate. She was made safe, and then she could do whatever she wanted to. So what happens a lot of times with police officers is that they'll go to a violent scene, and by the time they get there, often they're not interrupting what's going on. The batterer has already battered. He's had his release. He's had this explosion, and he's sitting there pretty calmly going, no, there's nothing wrong. And she's going, you know, fuck him, fuck you, fuck everybody. This is the worst thing in the world. How come you guys weren't here? You're really terrible. Every time I call, nothing ever happens. So she has had these moments or hours of terror where she's not been able to do anything besides protect herself. And here comes this police officer to the rescue. Her batterer has already had his fix, basically, and she's been terrified, and she's safe now to start saying all of that stuff and to vent everything. And the batterer's sitting there going, yeah, you know, she kind of gets like this sometimes. Who does it look like is crazy? Yeah. Those are part of the dynamics of family violence. So it's not been a real comfortable thing. Anybody that's worked with couples in violent relationships has noticed that dynamic before, you know, where you sat there and he looks real real calm and real rational, and you feel like saying to her, well, why don't you just ask him if he would do that? Well, why don't you just confront him on his behavior? And that sounds real fine. And again, we have to look at the balance of power. If we're looking at people who are in a relationship like this, where it's peer, that would work. Or at least, even if he didn't agree, or she didn't agree, nobody's going to get beat up over it, and they'll deal with it. But if we're going like this, and you're asking this person down here to confront this person up here, they're at risk of being beat up. It's not all right. Okay, so that's legally. And then the last aspect is that there's been a lack of acceptance and awareness. We as a society, and we personally, look at no matter how wonderful we are and how much we want to change and how much we're committed to changing ourselves, we still have this little desire to protect ourselves. Okay? We want to think the best thing that we possibly can of ourselves. And how we do that sometimes is to not pay attention, what we referred to earlier, not pay attention to the fact that there are imperfect families and that we live in a society that fosters this kind of an attitude. So that's a pretty easy way for us to protect ourselves. And unless you have commercials like this in your face all the time, it's pretty easy for us to write it off. If we're not personally affected, then we can pretend like it's somebody else. And even if we are personally affected, we can pretend like it's somebody else and this is a fluke, but I'm not going to talk to anybody else about it. Another way that we protect ourselves is by talking about people other than us or different from us or with different problems from us as sick. So battered women get labeled sick all the time. Batterers get labeled sick all the time. Well, I'm here to tell you, and I think that any of you that have worked with batterers and with battered victims for any length of time know that they are not sick. They are just like you and me. Battered women are not sick. Battered women do not need psychological counseling to quit being battered. Battered women do not get battered because they have low self-esteem. If a person is battered, their self-esteem suffers, let me tell you, but that is not the reason that they are battered. So, as advocates, as helpers, as people that are trying to understand the dynamics of family violence, we need to understand that our job as far as the victim goes is providing services and encouraging her and doing that with an attitude that says, geez, this is a hard situation and here's some stuff that's helpful, not you're sick too and so if you both go to counseling, it's going to help. I'm a real advocate of counseling. I think that counseling is great, and I think everybody should be in counseling, personally. But I think we have a problem societally, and we have a problem within our agencies if what we're thinking is that due to a person's victimization, they have mental health problems that if they go and get counseling are going to stop their victimization. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. Battering is a crime. Abuse is a crime. And if somebody came up to me on the street and hit me, there wouldn't be 10 people telling me, well, maybe, Jackie, if you go to counseling and kind of deal with what your attitude is, or if 5 people hit me on the street for whatever, who knows what reason, people might start to wonder about what I'm saying on the street. But for the most part, I'm not going to get scooted into counseling to take care of the fact that I've been a victim. Okay? I'm not saying that individuals don't have problems. Good heavens, there are many, many, many battered women. You will meet battered women that you just don't like. You will meet battered women that have multiply diagnosable problems. But it's not because of those problems that they're battered. They are battered because the partner they were with made a choice to commit a criminal act. So the attitude that people are sick is not valid. Batterers, the statistic that I have indicates that batterers are no more likely to have mental illness than the general population, and the general population is somewhere between 2 and 5% mental illness in the general population. Batterers are not monsters. Batterers are, for the most part, often good people. I would say, from my experience, almost always wounded people. And they are definitely people who have learned some inappropriate and criminal behaviors in order to deal with issues in their lives. That doesn't make them a monster. and our labeling them monsters does nothing except make them other again, make us feel good because batterers are monsters, so, and I'm not a monster, so therefore I can't be a batterer. The same thing with battered women. Two of the most strong stereotypes I hear mentioned about battered women are, one, either that she's wimpy, mousy, and can't stand up for herself, and that's why she's battered, or the other one is that she's shrewish and a bitch, and she deserves it. Okay? Now, if you were being battered, and you knew, because you'd heard around, that that was the attitude that most people had about battered women, you'd probably be pretty protective about who you wanted to tell. And then, when you went to tell people or tell agencies, and they treated you with that kind of an attitude, or they looked away and didn't make eye contact with you, or they acted like you told them a nasty thing, how likely would you be to go back to that agency for another try? Not very likely. If you were put into the system as a battered person and you had to keep dealing with somebody or with an agency in general that had that kind of an attitude, how cooperative would you be with that agency? And if you weren't cooperative with that agency because you were scared and you didn't like the attitudes they had towards you, what kind of labels would be put on you by that agency? Okay, those are some of the things that we just kind of forget because we're busy doing our jobs and doing well at doing our jobs. We kind of forget that there are individual circumstances and everybody doesn't plug in that way. So anyway, lack of acceptance and awareness, that's the final factor. Battered women are just like me, they are just like you. I have, in the past 13 years, dealt with doctors who have been battered women, with attorneys who have been battered women, with people with a lot of education and a lot of money, with people with no education and no money, with people of all different races who have been battered women. I also facilitate batterers education groups out of my office, and I've not worked with as many batterers as I have battered women, but I've worked with attorneys who have been batterers. I have worked with a doctor who's been a batterer. I work with ranchers. I work with Indian men. I work with all kinds of white men, whatever their ethnic background is. My experience holds true with what the statistics say, which is that everybody has the possibility. There are learned behaviors that cause battering, okay? And they're yucky behaviors, and it's awful, and we need to not condone that behavior. But we also need to not label batterers as the scummy guy down the street, because the batterer may be the nice doctor next door, okay? All right. Would somebody tell me the time? I came without a watch as well. 9:25? Okay. So, when we start talking about the dynamics of violence, that's the first thing that I want you to think about. Dynamics of violence have to do with our society. They have to do with how we're set up as a society. My partner, when I was getting ready for this talk, I was telling him about, this is what I'm going to do and this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to show the commercial because I want to talk about society and how society contributes to the dynamics. And he said, well, in all of the stuff that you've done, have you ever seen, because we have these sheets and you have some in there, the characteristics of a batterer, characteristics of a battered woman? And he said, have you ever seen a sheet that has like the characteristics of a society in which battering occurs? And I said, oh, that makes really good sense. Okay, so we need to think in terms of how we as a society, how we individually, how we as agencies might foster this kind of attitude that contributes to domestic violence continuing, rather than trying to put it on one lone victim, which is what usually happens, although now there's at least a little bit of increase in trying to make the batterer be accountable. You have a power and control wheel in your packet. It's a circle, and it has spokes coming out from it, and it says control, power and control right in the middle. How many of you, just just wave your hand. How many of you are familiar with the power and control wheel? Mostly everybody? Okay, I won't go into it a lot, but basically, the body of expertise and research on domestic violence indicates at this point that the reason that battering occurs, the reason the batterer batters, is because that batterer wants to exert control over another person's behavior. The power and control wheel was created by a group of women who identified themselves as an action group, formerly battered women, from Duluth, Minnesota. Excuse me. Duluth is started one of the pioneering networking and intervention projects in the country dealing with domestic violence. So they have good laws, and they deal with each other as if every field are experts in that field, which I think was really innovative at the time, and still with some of our communities is really innovative. The battered women's advocates really believe that the judges have an expertise in judging and in upholding the law, and that the police officers have a real expertise in their policing, and that the counselors have a real expertise in their counseling, and they kind of have this mutual respect and still probably a little bit of wariness, but they all work together and hold each other accountable for their reactions to domestic violence in that community. Duluth, by the way, is about the same size as Billings, Montana, so this is not like this big metropolitan area, and they've done some fantastic work. But the women in Duluth from the action group got together, and part of their discussions were, so what makes battering? It's not just because he hits me. And they came up with a model that was this power and control wheel. You can see at the center, the reason that battering occurs, that a batterer batters, is to exert control over another person's behavior. The violence, the physical violence, can actually be a very small part of a battering relationship. And that's indicated by the hub, is that called the hub? On the outside of the wheel. And then they decided that there were a lot of behaviors that their batterers did that they considered battering, and that made them feel the same way, and that made them afraid to leave the situation that didn't have anything to do with being hit. There was always that underlying fear that the hitting might happen, but they chose, I think it's 8 types of emotional violence that happened in their relationships, and they labeled them. So what I'd like is for you, what I'd encourage you to do is to get connected with the domestic violence programs in your area, because they have the expertise in these kinds of dynamics. Go over the power and control wheel. The more you understand the power and control wheel, the more you're going to understand when a batterer comes in and says, I didn't do anything, okay? The more you're going to understand when a battered woman comes in and says, gosh, he hasn't hit me, but I'm still scared, okay? Emotional violence. If a batterer calls names, makes her feel crazy, tells her that she's crazy, that's one type of emotional abuse that happens. Isolation happens often in battering relationships. So batterers may not say, many batterers do say you can't go anyplace, but a lot of batterers don't do that. A lot of batterers will say, I feel kind of jealous when you go, and I miss you when you're not here. Or I wish you wouldn't take that job because you might have to work some hours when I get to be home, and then I wouldn't be able to spend time with you. Okay? Or they might say when you come home from dinner with a friend, well, so what'd you talk about? What'd she tell you? Yeah, I heard that she was a slut, All of these kinds of interrogatories that make a battered woman feel like she's needing to defend herself, defend her friends. It may get to be such a problem that a battered woman, in effect, isolates herself. It's not that she's making a choice to do that, but because it's so painful when she comes home and he says, how come you were gone for 13 minutes when I know it only takes 10 minutes to go down the store to the Quick Way? What were you doing in the meantime? Okay. So battered women are often isolated, or if they're not isolated totally, like they're not locked in their homes, they are isolated to a point that when they're in this relationship with the batterer and he's going like this and like this, there's not somebody else that's going, oh, you're a really wonderful person. I worked with this one woman that was that identified as a formerly battered woman, and this was years after the fact, and she said, you know, I remember feeling really bad when my husband told me, you know, the problem with you, Darlene, is that you choose friends that like you. And she said, I felt so bad, and I was trying to tell him, no, you know, I'm not trying to do that. And the message that this person gives is, I know what's wrong, and you're wrong, and everything you do is wrong, so anything that anybody else says is not valid. And if this person has been isolated to such an extent that they don't have anybody else saying, gosh, Jackie, you know, you're really wonderful, and I really like you, and I can live with you being late, okay? Then this person is going to start thinking, well, you know, that might have something to do with it. It doesn't make one gosh darn bit of difference how this person's esteem was to start out with. If this person's esteem is up here and somebody keeps telling them yuck, 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 your esteem's going to be affected. You're not going to deal with battered women whose esteem has not been affected. Within this relationship, it's going to be affected. I might be the smartest, most accomplished person in the world, and if every day I'm with somebody who has an attitude that I'm scummy, there's something in all of us that's going to make us wonder about that. Okay, so isolation is major. Another major thing that I'm going to go into right now, the rest I would encourage you to just look at and become familiar with, is minimization, denial, and blame. Batterers are not accountable for their behavior. We do not live in a society that requires batterers to be accountable for their behavior. We live in a society that when a woman says, he beat me up, we'll often say to her, what did you do? Okay? And batterers know that. Batterers live in the same society that the rest of us do, so they use that and they play on that. Minimization, denial, and blame happens all the time. So a batterer will say often, I had this, like I said, I do batterers group, and there was this one court-mandated batterer. By the way, I've worked with probably 150 batterers, and most of them I have really liked. This man I did not like. And he was very charming, and I was charmed by him, but he was very difficult to work with. He was mandated, he was arrested and convicted of domestic violence. That's why he had to be mandated to go to batterers group. Every week he would come to batterers group and he would say, and at the intake he told me, you know, the only reason she has bruises on her neck is because she's taking medication. And she bruises easily, and that's why she has finger mark bruises on her neck. It's not because I choked her, it was because she bruised easily. And his other excuse was, I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was just trying to scare her. Therefore, I wasn't battering her, okay? He didn't mean it. And another one was that he was arrested, and then after he was arrested and while he was in jail, she even went and talked to the judge and asked the judge to please drop the charges. So obviously it was just the blank, blank, blank police and judge, because even his wife didn't think he should be in jail. So he minimized, he denied, he blamed everybody else but himself for his actions. Now, that's a more obvious case, but often you'll see something like that happening. Batterers will often say, I wouldn't have to do this if you would just, okay? And if you would just could be anything. If you would just shut up. If you would just do this. But I'm not responsible for my actions because you're doing this, okay? Denial, minimization, blame, all of those are just vital. He's just shaking his head. You've seen this before. The other thing about the physical violence is that you will often, I worked with one woman, I was the director of the shelter in Bozeman, Montana for a while. One of the women that came in there, and she was a real quiet, what some people might call a mousy little woman, but she was definitely battered as well. And she was very afraid of her batter. Her batter happened to be on the sheriff's department in Gallatin County. And he was a scary looking guy. She was little. He was big. He had his guns, you know, and he would tower over her and threaten to take her to Warm Springs, and in fact had tried to get her committed at Warm Springs before. He had hit her one time toward the beginning of their marriage. He didn't beat her up. He hit her one time, and he hit her good one. And when I saw her, she had been married to him for 17 years. And she was still afraid that he would hit her. She didn't live in terror every day that he was going to hit her. But he used all of those tactics on the power and control wheel. So she knew, even if she didn't have a good intellectual definition and understanding of what was going on, her gut feeling was that it felt the same as when he hit her. So she still had this fear that she was going to be hit. And my guess is that she was at pretty good risk for being hit if she didn't do a lot of things that she had done in order to protect herself. And that's another thing that happens in battering, is that often a battered woman, I do battered women's support groups and have done those for 5 years. And women will often come into the group and say, well, I do these really awful things. I called him a name and I do this and I'm really awful. I probably batter him just as much as he batters me. And what they're doing is trying to be accountable because they know that they're acting in a way that if they were in this kind of relationship, they wouldn't do. But because they're in this kind of relationship, they may lie if they're 5 minutes late getting back from the store and they know that he's gonna get after them because they probably were fucking the busboy. They might say something else. Not just that, oh, I stopped at the magazine rack for 5 minutes, but they might say, I ran out of gas or something that to themselves feels awful because it's like, geez, why am I telling a lie? I'm just a bad person. And if he knew about it, he'd sure tell her she was a bad person. But that's a way that she protects herself, okay? Battered women, if you have a good program, a good battered victims support agency in your area, that agency is going to be encouraging a battered woman to do whatever she has to do to protect herself. We're not talking about guns and karate here, but we're talking about setting things up, lying if she has to, going along with what he says, agreeing with what he says so she doesn't get hit back. And again, a good battered women's advocacy agency is not going to tell her, well, you do this and you do that. But what they will tell her is, you do what you need to do to protect yourself and your children. And I know it doesn't feel good, and I know that that's not what you choose to do if you were in this kind of relationship. But if you're in this kind of relationship, and it's a matter of telling the truth or being beat up, you might want to make a different choice than you'd make if you were in this kind of relationship. So be aware of those kind of dynamics going on. And then again, just the hitting deal. One hit or a little bit of hitting still sets the stage for the relationship to be like this. One hit takes a lot of time and a lot of accountability on the batter for a relationship to get back like this. I do not see a lot of relationships in which there's been domestic violence moving from here to here. I do believe it's possible, and I do believe that I've worked with a couple couples that have worked really hard and are on the road and go like this sometimes, but it's not a thing that's easy to overcome. Cycle of violence. Just keep me in. The cycle of violence is in your manual, and it's another circle. I think she has it. While you're looking for the cycle of violence, I just saw there's an equality wheel in your manual as well. That was something that was developed a few years later in Duluth by the same group of people. It's like, okay, so now we know what makes a yucky relationship. What's the counterpart to that? What makes a good relationship? And the center of that, they decided, was equality, to work equally. And then there are counterparts to each of, okay, the cycle of violence isn't a circle in this one. It's kind of squiggles, and how far is it from the back of it?
It's from time to time.
control wheel.
Oh, it's right behind the power and control wheel on the other side.
2 or 3 pages behind.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Lenore Walker was one of the pioneer researchers in this country on the subject of domestic violence. One of the theories that she initially came up with in trying to answer questions for herself and in working with battered women, with the same question that you know you've asked this before. We all know that we've asked this before, whether it's of ourselves or of clients that we've worked with or of peers, of friends. Why does she stay in this relationship? Well, if I started going out with somebody and first thing that he did was to bop me, I wouldn't be going out with him anymore. So it doesn't work like that. If I were in a relationship with somebody and the first thing he did was bop me and continue to bop me, I'd be looking for whatever way I could to get out of there, because he would not have had the opportunity to affect my concept of myself. He would not have had the opportunity to isolate me. He would not have had the opportunity to use all of those emotionally abusive tactics on the power and control wheel. But it truly does not happen like that. When a battered woman goes out with a batterer, gets connected up with a batterer is, like we said, the person next door. The civic-minded, politically correct, wonderful, romantic person, almost always, not always, but almost always, that's the kind of presentation that a battered woman will get, pre-battery, the pre-battered woman. So what'll happen is that often it's a real blow, not just a physical blow, but it's a real blow then when this wonderful epitome of goodness and the best partner in the world acts in a snotty, ugly way. And it's very subtle, the progression. There's some real grooming that happens, I believe, in battering relationships. So the first time they've had this great relationship, and maybe they get in an argument and he says something mean, calls her a name. And it's a surprise because this person has never done that before. And then he'll probably say sorry afterwards, or they'll figure it out and she'll just write it off, because for the most part he's acting nice and charming and he said he's sorry and doesn't have to worry about that anymore. But the next time they get into an argument, maybe he gets mad and storms out. And maybe as he's storming out, he accidentally bumps her on his way out of the room. Can you hear me? If I'm talking, it's not okay. I gotta move. And that doesn't feel right to her, but he apologizes and they fix things, and things are back to normal for a while. And maybe the third time they get into one of these kind of arguments, he won't just brush her on the way past. Maybe he'll give her a little shove, and he's moving through the door. But he hasn't hit her, and he apologizes afterwards. So it's kind of like this progression to a worse and worse type of behavior. So by the time a battered woman is first hit, there's been some grooming to the fact where her defenses are already put off. Whereas if he came up and stopped her the first discussion, she might go, whoa, I don't know about that. But because he shoved, because he called a name, because it progressed into that, she is much less likely to take immediate action, because they would have already, the dynamics of the cycle of violence would have already been established within that relationship. If you look at the cycle of violence, the basic theory behind that is that with the cycle of violence, there is walking on eggshells, a tension building phase. You kind of know something's going to happen. You can feel it. It doesn't feel good. She tries to keep the kids quiet so they don't disturb Dad. She tries to make sure that she gets the dinner done on time, or that she pays all of the bills. There's that. You know what's going to happen. You do whatever you can to keep it from happening. Then there's what's called an acute battering incident. I don't know what it's called here. the acute battering phase. It's when the hit happens. It is usually much shorter in length than the first part of the cycle of violence. It can be as short as a hit. It can last up to a couple hours, or in severe instances, a day long or a couple days long. But it's acute, there's an end to it. Often, and particularly in the beginning of a battering relationship, what will happen afterwards is that there will be a loving respite stage, hearts and flowers, honeymoon stage. What happens at that time is that the batterer will act like he did in the first stages of their relationship. He will act like the person that she believes and wants him to be, like the person that she fell in love with. He will be often very sincerely remorseful. He's not just crying and saying sorry because he's, at least initially, because he's trying to pull something over on her. He often will feel really bad that he did such an awful thing. He'll say sorry. He'll say it won't happen again. Many battered women get gifts during this phase. It's what she wants to believe. And it's the truth for that bit of time. It's not that this woman is stupid. It's the truth as the batterer sees it and as the victim sees it for that bit of time. So she lets it go that time. Or she might let it go and build a little bit of wariness, but it's gone. It's not like somebody's getting hit and hit and hit and hit, and they're just sitting there going, well, I don't think I should leave this relationship, and I don't know why. There is some letting go and some pulling and some bad and some good. All of that has to do with the dynamics of violence. All of us have been in relationships in which things like that have happened. When we knew kind of it wasn't a good relationship, we're not being battered or anything, but it's not a real good relationship. But when something yucky happens, then something good happens. And he's just like how when you first fell in love with him, or she's the most wonderful person in the world, just like the first time you looked at her. So try and translate how it's been for us in those kind of relationships to be magnified 20, 30, 100 times for how it is for a battered woman. Those are the dynamics of violence. Lenore Walker, by the way, has kind of revised, she spoke in Billings a few years ago, and she's just done more refinement on her theory of the cycle of violence. And that's that she just is encouraging us to remember that there's not just an even little pace. You know, it's good, it's bad, it's tension building, it's bad, it's good. She said sometimes there's never a honeymoon period. Some people escalate real quickly. Sometimes there's no tension building period. It goes from acute to honeymoon to acute to honeymoon. There are different phases in this. Some women are able to identify a cycle of violence and say, yeah, we have a honeymoon period for pretty much a year, and then it's tension building for pretty much 6 months. It's different for every person. And probably most of the victims that you talk with, if they think about it for a while, can identify something like the cycle of violence. Another thing to remember about the cycle of violence, not the cycle, but the dynamics of violence, is that battered women become disempowered. I think that some of us that have been working in this field, in whatever our fields are, know that disempowered and empowerment have kind of become the word to use. But look at it in terms of the same thing that happens to a battered woman hostages. There's been some, I forgot the name of that organization. Amnesty International has a list of psychological torture that they use to determine whether a organization or a country has been abusive to political prisoners. If you get a list of Amnesty International's dynamics of psychological torture and pull out your power and control wheel, they are the same systems. Amnesty International is calling those psychological torture. We're calling this the cycle of violence. It is the same thing. This is a system of psychological torture that is perpetrated on a victim in order to control her. If Amnesty International were stepping into a lot of the homes where domestic violence occurred, they'd be putting all kinds of sanctions against batterers and against our systems that we belong to that collude with the continuation of this process. In a hostage situation, there's something that's called the Stockholm Syndrome, and it's looked at hostages and some of their connections with their kidnappers. Sometimes hostages, even when they're let go, still feel this real bond with the people that have victimized, who have kidnapped them. There has been documentation of hostages who have been let go and have gone to visit their, can't tell me the word for that, I'm not, kidnappers, visit their kidnappers in jail, okay? This is a very intense, emotionally and psychologically intense situation that has been set up by a kidnapper. There are the same dynamics that go on in domestic violence. The kidnapper is mean, they're oppressive, they steal the person and make them a victim. But they're also the person that gives them food. They're also the person that makes sure they stay alive. They're also the person that that occasionally will give them some kind of emotional support. They're their emotional connection with the world. That happens in battering situations. That's the dynamics of domestic violence. And I would encourage us all, no matter what agency we belong to, no matter what our field of expertise, to start thinking of it as psychological torture. Domestic violence is psychological torture. Time. Somebody tell me the time. Do I have 5 minutes to wrap up? Okay. I, in an hour, cannot tell you all of the dynamics of domestic violence. The domestic violence service providers in your community have all of this information. They are experts in this field. They would gladly do an in-service for your agency. My guess is that most of the agencies would be glad to work with you on developing community networks. Like I said to start out with, domestic violence is not solely a therapeutic problem. Domestic violence is not solely a legal problem. Domestic violence is a societal and therefore a political problem. We are not going to end domestic violence in our society unless we develop a cohesive community approach, unless we, as service providers, no matter what service we're providing, unless we are respectful of the expertise of other service providers, unless we recognize that we are all in this together, and our family violence networks that we're going to be developing probably will have some batterers within them, probably will have some battered victims within them. It's not a disease. It's not something nasty. It is a problem, and as a problem, can be creatively worked at to be solved. So I would encourage you to do that. And by the way, political is a word that gets brought up a lot when you're doing domestic violence. And you hear people talk about, well, you know, we don't want to get too political. But I would encourage you again, political means, I mean, look it up in the dictionary. It was like I did this before, because there was some discussion before I did this presentation about how political is, and how political we want to be, and how political I want to be in. Political is a good thing. Changes don't happen unless they're political changes. Political means doing something with planning. It means organizing. It means figuring things out. It means recognizing the interlocking pieces and working at it from that standpoint. I would hope that all of us would be political. I would hope that all of us would be activists. Gloria Steinem had a book a few years back that was called Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions. And then I heard her speak, and in referring to her book, she encouraged us all to go out and do an outrageous act in everyday rebellion, to do an outrageous act a day. And what she said at that time, and what I've continued to think, is that for some, it's real different for some people, an outrageous act, than for other people. For some people, an outrageous act is sitting here and listening to me say all of this stuff for the last hour. If that's an outrageous act for you, chalk it up and put it on your list and say, yeah, I did my outrageous act for today. For some of us, if we sit around in a community where everybody's sitting in a rocking chair and rocking back and forth and rocking back and forth, then our outrageous act may be just standing up. That's all that you have to do an outrageous act. It's up to you to decide, but I believe that we are all morally and ethically responsible for doing outrageous acts, not just in this field, in all fields. And that's what's going to help end domestic violence. There's an author that I like a lot. Her name is Naomi Little Bear, and I just like to end with this, and I hope you go out thinking about this all day long. And she says that complacency is a far more dangerous attitude than outrage. So be outraged and do outrageous acts. Thanks.